Hello Internet, I'm Jackie Fox, and today we're going to talk about the subject of theft. And we're going to be focusing on this issue for the next couple of videos, and while it is complex, and while there are a lot of different things involved in telling the full story, it can be summed up pretty simply in one photograph. Meanwhile, this is how the media represents theft, largely covering only this small portion of that same photograph.
Brazen crimes caught on camera show exactly why American cities are under siege. Check out what happened at a Walgreens in San Francisco. This is a man in broad daylight looting a store and just filling up a garbage bag. Then he just casually rides his bike out of the store and onto the street. Walgreens alone has closed 17 stores in the city just because of this rampant theft. And other companies are following suit.
Hey, my name is Chris Pagopoulos. I've been in this company for 42 years. And when it comes to shoplifting, this is the worst I've ever seen.
With merchandise locked up on store shelves across the city, store owners are trying to combat shoplifting.
One of our managers down in our 24th Street store, Ray Acevedo, was attacked.
The owner of grocery store chain Gristedes says shoplifting is up nearly 50% in his stores. Meat manager Stephen Grossman stocks the shelves only for them to be swiped, particularly the high-end steaks.
These series of thefts in two major cities have been referred to as a crime wave. And while the right is certainly breathlessly reporting this, it is also being reported on the left, or at least the liberal media as well, and equally tastelessly.
Somebody stole a bunch of steaks from Trader Joe's, and this became the leading story. The leading story on MSNBC's Morning Joe.
They never seemed willing to ask why crime happens within a society, especially with the right framing this with the narrative of personal responsibility, but nobody necessarily wants to do crime.
Put every robbery together and you end up with an impressive number, $482 million. That's the massive amount that was stolen in just under 270,000 robberies in 2019. A total that includes house robberies, bank robberies, and even old-timey cowboy holdups. If you add to that number burglaries, larceny, and motor vehicle theft, you get around $13 billion of value stolen over just 12 months.
And yet, even that ain't much when compared to Bernie Madoff. He ended up stealing around $20 billion. And he did not just steal from rich people. A lot of the money invested with him was from pension funds who were just trying to make money so that people retiring could live. But here's where it really went south for me. Instead of individual one-off crimes, I decided to look at property crime in general. All robberies, all theft, all burglary, all auto theft per year added up is less than Bernie Madoff stole. Now this is per year. Bernie stole over a number of years, so it's not really a fair comparison, I guess. But since we're adding stuff up and looking at property crime, let's also add in the largest category of property crime, wage theft. That's when an employer steals a worker's labor by not paying them their legally required wages and benefits. Per year, somewhere between $20 and $60 billion of labor is stolen from workers in the US. More than Madoff stole every year. More than all other property crime. More than every stolen car, burglary, shoplifting, all that stuff combined. And yet, while there are hundreds of thousands of law enforcement officers who work on all those property crime bits, there are around 1,000 who work on wage theft. And the companies doing it find it more efficient to pay the fines than to actually pay their workers, as Walmart has done 96 times in the last 20 years.
There are some people who enjoy the thrill of getting away with something, but for most people, the return would have to be pretty high to risk being caught and entangled with the criminal justice system. And unlike a lot of high-profile corporate crimes, with shoplifting, it just isn't going to be profitable. In one of these stories, we hear about someone taking 10 steaks from a Trader Joe's.
Here's a bloke who didn't get the message. Let's just have a look. We've talked also about the crime wave in New York. Here's a bloke stealing not one, but 10 steaks.
Did you pay for any of that?
Yep.
You did?
Yep.
You got a receipt?
Yep.
How come they were chasing you then?
They wanted the basket.
What?
They wanted the basket.
Oh, they wanted the basket. Okay. Those two guys were chasing you from the store. They said you didn't pay for any of it. Why are you stealing it?
So James, he didn't get the memo.
He didn't get the memo,
it's
but
colonialism.
this is also, this not only shows the incredible problem with crime in New York City now under years of socialist mismanagement, it's also opened up a huge fissure on the left, because on MSNBC, the great race-baiting clown Al Sharpton said, you know, even this was too much for him and they had to do something to clean up New York.
It is true that people are just walking in and walking out with it.
No, there's no doubt about it. I mean, you go to a local pharmacy, Dwayne Reed or Rite Aid, any of them, and you've got to get someone to help assist you. I mean, they have the little button there.
Yep.
You hit the buzzer, and the guy comes over and unlocks your toothpaste.
Yes.
I mean, we're talking about basic stuff.
As well.
What did I miss that we now have to lock up toothpaste?
Yeah, and even if those are particularly expensive steaks, that's worth at most like $300. Now, if they're stealing these to eat them and they space out a little portion of these over the week, and, you know, eating a little bit of the steak every day, then that might be able to cover their meat for a month and take a big expense out of the pressure of having to feed themselves. But a long-term narrative that we've heard, especially before meat prices went up, which is a separate issue that we're going to cover a little bit later in this video, but this made meat more competitive with previous stolen items before the Prime Wave, like Tide laundry detergent, especially Tide Pods.
Okay, they go for high-price items like Tide, Häagen-Dazs ice cream, Dove soap, and meat.
The Tide Pod Challenge has taken the internet by storm. The recent fad involves biting the brightly colored laundry detergent.
Now, as we discovered very publicly online, Tide Pods are not edible, so the argument before meat prices skyrocketed were that these people couldn't possibly be stealing from stores to feed themselves because they were stealing laundry detergent. It just so happens that among the things that you can easily stuff in your cart, detergent happens to be among the highest priced. And just think, if you can get, say, like 15 containers of Tide Pods for $40 a piece into a shopping cart, make it out of the store, not only is that a lot easier to load into your car than, say, even $100 worth of cans of soup, but also at $40 a piece, that's $600 worth of Tide Pods. Naturally, you wouldn't want to do this very often, so maybe you could only do this, I mean, at the most, like once a week. So we're looking at being super reckless, and, you know, at this point, you're really only potentially making a return that's similar to low-wage jobs that are available in the market. And the major drawback to doing this instead of doing one of those low-wage jobs, it's incredibly risky and it could ruin the rest of your life, because, you know, the Fox News anchors like to make it seem like the police aren't pursuing this, but, you know, or the security guard isn't pursuing this, but, you know, he's got a video of that guy. He's going to show up in court, and even if they don't throw him away for 5 years, he's going to come out of this having to report that he is a convicted shoplifter on every job application for the rest of their life. So that necessarily ruins most of their ability to get the kind of low-wage work that competes with this. But there's also another thing here that you're not thinking about, and it's the fact that no one buys stolen Tide for full price. And typically speaking, if you steal it, it becomes a full-time and even riskier job to try to sell it to people. So people typically use something called a fence for this reason. And if your fence is going to cut into your profit margin even further, because this person has to take on the risk of like offloading the stolen product for you. So instead of this being like a $600 payday every week for one shopping cart full of Tide Pods, suddenly you're risking the rest of your life just to get like $200 from that shopping cart. So this should be preferable to no one, to even a minimum wage job. The fact that people are even willing to do this to begin with suggests that there is a severe economic disadvantage being placed on certain populations of people, because it would suggest that they're unable to get any job at all outside of shoplifting Tide. Because if they could find places where there were good opportunities, because, you know, there are places where good opportunities don't exist, and in lieu of them, people are doing what they have to do to survive and keep themselves from being homeless. And with the rent prices going up, that's going to require stealing more and more Tide or steaks or whatever it is that you're trying to offload to sell to pay your rent.
I think the point we ultimately come to here is we are under the illusion that we live in a free market capitalist system. And we in no way live in a free market capitalist system. But the thing that's so surprising to me is your knowledge of this is not what I hear on the news. I have not heard one person talking about the excessive profit margins on like network news. They all talk about this is out of control. We don't know how to stop it. The Fed's gonna jump in. Not one has said, or, one thing we could do is maybe not jack prices so high during this time.
Yeah, look, I think this is very undercovered. I'll tell you where you'll find it, is you find it in business reporting. Business Insider, Forbes, Yahoo Finance, CNBC, Squawk Box, like they cover earnings calls because that's important information to cover as they track the stock market. And frankly, investors come to those sources for information on those earnings calls. But, they cover it as a kind of like a little bit of a just the facts, ma'am kind of approach. And they also cover it, frankly, as an exciting development, which is inflation has been really good for business. Inflation is keeping the stock market. Yeah.
When I've tuned into those and they're talking about it, they don't ever say like, profit margins are not commensurate to the inflationary pressures of the supply chain. They always are like, look at these calls. Oh, the profit calls. Ladies and gentlemen, the bulls are running. This is amazing. Like nobody ever stops to go, oh, we're getting fucked.
And there's a lot of reporting about the supply chain and what's going on there. And the supply chain story, again, is actually, related to this exact story we're talking about here, which is why are these companies in a position to charge extra without fear of being undercut by competition? Well, 50 years of reshaping our economy through mergers and acquisitions, creating these giants, 4 people pack meat and get it to the grocery store. There are 3 major shipping cartels. Basically like one country handling all the semiconductors.
Jesus, this sounds like the mafia. This isn't free market capital. It's like, hey, it's a shame if something would happen to your chicken prices. You gotta watch yourself out there.
I see you, Tyson.
So the meat packers are definitely a mafia.
Since it's logically pretty irrational for a person, at least in good standing with society and good privilege with the world, is likely to do something like this, especially to see a spike this year must indicate that there is something systemically wrong with job opportunities and a person's ability to pay their bills. And it should be obvious what the cause of this is. It's the COVID pandemic and the pressures across the board, but also, incidentally, the inflation that we're facing, which is being brought on in part by supply chain issues, but also corporate greed. And I think it's no coincidence that we're seeing this spike, this issue suddenly accelerating at the same time that we're seeing Congress and the Biden administration give up on continuing a lot of pandemic-era programs that were helping people make ends meet. And you can see that this is especially true with the industry that brings meat to your local grocery store, which helps to explain why steak prices were able to skyrocket to the point where it became easier to get a good haul stealing steaks than it was to walk out of a store with a whole cartload full of Tide Pods.
This is the popular aisle when it comes to those 5-finger discounts, especially with these steaks over here. And they also tell me that with the addition of potential security guards, they hope that will deter people from stealing.
There's 4 people who run 85% of market share.
Is that good? I'm not an econ guy. Is that good? Is that good?
No.
Thumbs up or thumbs down on that?
Thumbs down.
Okay.
2 thumbs down. One of them's Tyson. Another one is this company, a Brazilian company called JBS. They just settled, of course, no fault, a price fixing settlement 2 weeks ago. But the 2 brothers who run the company are recently out of jail for bribery. This is not this is a lot less like your Econ 101 textbook and a lot more like The Sopranos. It absolutely is.
Wait, the chicken people are bribing people?
Yeah.
Okay, so the name is JBS, just bribing someone. It's in the title.
Right,
it's
Should we be saying all this stuff?
Isn't using a pandemic to bilk the general public under the name of out-of-control inflation and supply chain just a way to steal from more people at once? And if this is happening all across the market simultaneously, everyone is grifting us all at once, then why should I feel any sympathy to the owners of a lot of these big chain stores that are being hit with this, who themselves are either directly or indirectly grifting the public with the wares that they have to offer? We hear so many narratives on the news about why prices are going up. Hell, sometimes they even blame some of the insignificant amount of theft that shoplifting represents as being one of the reasons why prices are going up in the first place. But we don't often talk about price gouging. But a crime wave like this recent inflation and price gouging that has come along with it, this is a temporary exacerbation of an underlying issue that is constant. But there is an underlying issue that has remained constant and has resulted in far more theft than either of these things or even these two things combined. It's in a lot of the same stores that participated in this, but they have enough power that they can expect not to be challenged or written up on the local news. And that issue is wage theft.
You may have heard about it recently with the Walmart settlements, but it's not a very common term, so let me explain a bit. Very simply, wage theft is when you don't get paid even though you're supposed to. Whether it's because you worked overtime but it wasn't counted, had your tips withheld or not compensated for on a slow day, were misclassified as an independent contractor, were refused benefits as an employee, or just straight up didn't get your check, there are at least a dozen different ways your boss can steal the money that you're entitled to so that he can eat it. I mean, I assume that's what they do with it, right? They eat it. They're obviously not spending it, so they must be doing something. Anyway, the sad reality is that this happens to millions of American workers every year. While the individual amounts are pretty small if you take them week by week, added up, they get into the billions of dollars. At the low end, estimates that only include minimum wage violations total around $15 billion a year stolen from American workers. $15 billion. Already $2 billion more than the number we get from all those other forms of theft. At the high end, estimates that count several different forms of wage theft more than triple that number. And you end up with a whopping $50 billion price tag per year in America and thousands out of the average worker's hands. That's really bad.
A couple of people reached out to say how thankful they were that they found out a little bit more about wage theft so that they could actually talk to their employer about what they saw going on. And a number of people also just straight up was like, how could this much money be being taken? Like, how is that possible? So there are a few different ways that wage theft happens, and you can find these out on the internet, but let's just put them in a video for people. Number one, probably the top way that money gets stolen through wage theft is doctoring, like your manager asking you to do things so that you don't get paid overtime. To move stuff, and this happened to me when I worked at Walmart, and this wasn't what the wage theft settlement was about, but like there would be times when I would have already worked, I'd been clocked in for 36 hours, and then I had more than 4 hours scheduled, and my manager would give me these sort of like nudges to be like, you can't go overtime this pay period. We can't have you going overtime, but you do still have to work all of the hours that you're scheduled. And so that sort of like put it on me to figure out, like, what does that mean? Does that mean I have to get all my work done and then clock out early? Or does that mean that I have to clock out early and then keep working?
I myself had a full month of my wages stolen when I worked at Gold's Gym, and while everyone I worked with eventually got their money back, even after years of going and speaking with the manager after quitting my job, talking to their corporate people about when I would get my money back, I never did. And eventually it became clear to me that my only option was to hire a lawyer. But as a minimum wage worker who only worked part-time, under 28 hours a week, the amount of money that I would have to spend to hire a lawyer to represent me in this case could easily be far more money than I could possibly get out of them than they owed me for that month of wages. And if they steal a little bit from everyone, stealing a little bit from me, from you, from all of your coworkers, if they take enough from enough people, then they can count on this logic on the individual level to hold across the board. And this is really why with this type of theft, class action lawsuits are really designed for this, but it may be hard to get enough people involved and really organize in class action lawsuits against the purveyors of wage theft. But that is still one of the best ways to deal with this issue. But it really shouldn't be up to the public to sue these companies themselves. There should be some regulation or penalty that is large enough to discouraging them from doing this. And when I say I want to see a large enough penalty to discourage them from doing this, I mean that, like a lot of financial penalties for financial crimes, the amount of penalty has to be greater than the amount that they profited. And preferably that money should go not directly into the government, but should go to the victims of wage theft themselves, in the same way that a class action settlement would. So in the next episode, we're going to talk a bit more about Walmart and some of my irritations with the company, as well as some of the other corporate crimes, to give you kind of an idea of the scale of this issue.
Wage theft is terrible, but it's just a subset of a much larger problem: corporate and white-collar crime. You know corporate crime when you see it, but unfortunately it isn't very well defined. Oftentimes because an act committed by a corporation or someone acting as a white-collar worker may be objectionable, but not actually criminalized. And part of the reason is that in neoliberal and capitalist governments, political structures will always favor the accumulation of capital above just about anything else.
But there is one last thing to mention before I wrap this up that plays into the rest of the series. Notice how in these two issues, the frequency and the veracity of the media coverage seems connected with the class dynamics at play in the story. If the rich are stealing from the poor and the middle class, it's good they're making profits. If the poor steal from the rich just to survive, it's an insidious crime wave that must be endlessly reported on and that we must find a solution to now if we are to have a civil society. As if it is civil to steal from those who have nothing, yet totally uncivil to steal from those who can afford to stock a nationwide chain of stores with the things that you need to survive. As usual, I consider poverty and its repercussions to be the fault of the system that not only allows but encourages, nay, actively cheers on in the financial pages. And to the people who are responsible for this, even though you may not hear it in the media, shame on you all.